On March 29, 1461, Palm Sunday morning, approximately 50,000 to 80,000 Englishmen assembled on a snow-covered plateau near the village of Towton in Yorkshire and prepared to butcher each other in what would become the bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil. This was not a foreign invasion or a defense against conquest. This was Englishman versus Englishman, cousin against cousin, father against son, fighting in a civil war so vicious that contemporary chroniclers called it the slaughter of men. The Wars of the Roses had been raging for 6 years, a dynastic conflict between the House of York and the House of Lancaster over who would control the English throne. On one side stood the Yorkist forces, roughly 36,000 men commanded by the 19-year-old Edward IV, who had declared himself king just 3 weeks earlier. On the other side stood the Lancastrian army, roughly 42,000 soldiers fighting for King Henry VI and Queen Margaret of Anjou. As the armies formed battle lines in the early morning darkness, a blizzard began to blow from the south, driving blinding snow directly into the faces of the Lancastrian troops. By the time the battle ended 10 hours later, more than 28,000 men would be dead. Some estimates suggest up to 38,000, making it not just England's bloodiest battle, but possibly the deadliest single day's fighting in medieval European history by percentage of combatants killed. The Cock Beck River would be so choked with bodies that survivors could cross on bridges made of corpses. The snow would turn red across miles of countryside, and England's nobility would be so devastated that the political landscape of the kingdom would be permanently altered. To understand the absolute horror of Towton, you must understand the brutality of the Wars of the Roses. This was not chivalric warfare with rules and ransoms. This was total war where the loser faced execution, attainder of titles and lands, and destruction of entire family lines. The conflict had begun in 1455, when Richard, Duke of York, challenged the weak rule of King Henry VI, who suffered from periods of mental illness. Henry's French wife, Margaret of Anjou, effectively controlled the Lancastrian faction and was determined to preserve the throne for her son. The Yorkists believed they had a better claim to the throne through descent from Edward III. Between 1455 and 1461, several battles had been fought with both sides winning victories, but each battle became progressively more vicious. After the Second Battle of St. Albans in February 1461, the Lancastrians had allowed their northern troops, men from the Scottish borders who were essentially professional raiders, to loot their way south through England. The savagery shocked contemporaries. Entire villages were burned, women were raped, churches were plundered. This created enormous hatred toward the Lancastrians and strengthened Yorkist recruitment. When Edward of York, son of the deceased Richard, Duke of York, declared himself King Edward IV in London on March 4, 1461, he was riding a wave of popular support in southern England. But the Lancastrians still controlled the north with a larger army. The two forces would meet at Towton in late March to settle the issue permanently. The approach to Towton saw both armies marching through brutal winter conditions. Edward IV led his Yorkist army north from London through snow and freezing rain, covering roughly 180 miles in 13 days, an exhausting march that left his troops tired and hungry, but also hardened and ready to fight. The Lancastrian army under the Duke of Somerset and other commanders positioned itself near Towton, a strategic location controlling the road to York. Both sides understood this would be decisive. Whoever lost would be destroyed. On March 28, the day before the main battle, advance Yorkist forces under Lord Fauconberg fought a preliminary action at Ferrybridge, attempting to cross the River Aire. The Lancastrians attacked and killed several thousand Yorkists in brutal fighting. Among the dead was the Yorkist Lord Fitzwalter. But the Yorkists managed to secure a crossing, and Edward's main army crossed the river that evening and marched toward Towton. The armies spent the night of March 28 to 29th camped near each other, knowing that dawn would bring total war. Contemporary sources describe soldiers confessing their sins to priests and writing wills, understanding that tomorrow many would die. The commanders on both sides reportedly gave orders that no quarter should be given to captured nobles, meaning that unlike most medieval battles where aristocrats were captured for ransom, this battle would be fought to the death. The battlefield at Towton was a plateau between the villages of Towton and Saxton, roughly 1,000 yards wide and several miles long. sloping gently toward the Cock Beck ravine on the Lancastrian right flank. The terrain gave no obvious advantage to either side, though the Lancastrians held slightly higher ground initially. Both armies were composed almost entirely of infantry, because English medieval warfare had shifted from cavalry-dominated battles to infantry with longbowmen. The Yorkists fielded approximately 36,000 men, including perhaps 12,000 longbowmen. The Lancastrians had approximately 42,000 men, including up to 15,000 archers. These were the largest armies ever assembled in England, far larger than Agincourt or any previous English battle. Most soldiers were common men, yeomen and townspeople conscripted or paid to fight, wearing simple padded jacks or brigandines, carrying bills, poleaxes and swords. The nobles and men-at-arms wore plate armor and fought on foot alongside their troops. This would not be a cavalry battle, but a grinding infantry slugfest with archery, determining the initial phases. As dawn approached on March 29th, both armies formed battle lines in the darkness, but visibility was terrible because a blizzard was beginning to intensify from the south. The blizzard that struck Towton on Palm Sunday morning was not unusual for late March in Yorkshire, but it would prove decisive. Contemporary chroniclers describe winds driving snow directly into the faces of the Lancastrian troops, who were positioned facing south toward the Yorkist lines. The Yorkists, facing north, had the wind at their backs. Visibility was reduced to perhaps 50 yards at best. In some accounts, soldiers couldn't see their own standards. Lord Fauconberg, commanding the Yorkist vanguard, recognized the tactical opportunity immediately. He ordered his archers to advance within range of the Lancastrian lines, shoot a volley of arrows, then retreat. The wind carried the Yorkist arrows farther than normal, reaching the Lancastrian lines with full force. The Lancastrian archers, blinded by snow and unable to see the Yorkist positions clearly, shot back into the blizzard. But their arrows fell short, exhausted by shooting into the wind, landing harmlessly in the snow-covered ground. The Yorkist archers then advanced, collected the fallen Lancastrian arrows and shot them back. This exchange continued for perhaps an hour, with Yorkist arrows killing and wounding Lancastrians, while Lancastrian arrows achieved nothing. Thousands of Lancastrian soldiers were hit by arrows they couldn't see coming through the blinding snow. The psychological effect was devastating. Men died without seeing their killers. The Lancastrian commanders, watching their vanguard being destroyed by invisible arrows, made the fatal decision to advance and close with the Yorkists, abandoning their defensive position and moving downhill through the snow. The Lancastrian advance began around 9 a.m. and turned the battle into a massive infantry melee that would last 10 hours without break. 42,000 Lancastrian soldiers in loose battle formations moved forward through the blizzard toward the Yorkist lines. When they emerged from the blinding snow and collided with the Yorkist army, the battle became hand-to-hand combat across a front roughly 1,000 yards wide. Soldiers fought with bills, poleaxes, swords, warhammers, and daggers. A bill was a pole weapon with a hooked blade, designed to pull down opponents or strike with brutal force. A poleaxe was shorter but heavier, capable of crushing armor or splitting skulls. Combat was face-to-face, shield-to-shield, a grinding push of thousands of men where the front ranks killed each other, while the rear ranks pushed forward over the bodies of the fallen. Contemporary accounts describe the noise as deafening, men screaming, weapons clanging on armor, orders being shouted, the wounded crying out. The snow turned the battlefield into hell. Men slipped on ice and blood, bodies piled up, creating obstacles that had to be climbed over. Wounded men fell and were trampled by their own comrades. The battle had no clear front line, just chaotic zones of combat where thousands of individual fights merged into general slaughter. The initial Lancastrian attack was successful. Their superior numbers began to push the Yorkists back. Edward IV, just 19 years old but already an experienced commander and physically imposing at 6'4", fought personally in the front ranks, rallying his troops and preventing complete collapse. Contemporary sources describe Edward fighting like a lion, killing several opponents personally and refusing to retreat despite being wounded multiple times. But the Lancastrian numbers were telling. The Yorkist line bent, then began to break in several places. By mid-morning, the Yorkists were being pushed back hundreds of yards, giving ground steadily, suffering heavy casualties. If the battle had continued this way, the Lancastrians would have won through sheer attrition. But around noon, the tactical situation changed dramatically when Yorkist reinforcements arrived. The Duke of Norfolk, who had been delayed on the march north, arrived with several thousand fresh troops and hit the Lancastrian left flank. This flank attack created chaos in the Lancastrian formation. Soldiers who had been pushing forward suddenly found themselves being attacked from the side. Units tried to turn to face the new threat, creating gaps in their lines. The Yorkists, sensing the momentum shift, counter-attacked across the entire front. What had been a Lancastrian advance became a confused melee where neither side had clear advantage, and exhaustion became the dominant factor. The fighting continued for hours, with neither side breaking. This was unprecedented. Most medieval battles lasted a few hours at most before one side routed. Towton went on for 10 hours because both sides understood that losing meant death. There would be no ransom, no mercy, no escape. Every soldier knew that if his side lost, he would be hunted down and killed. This turned Towton into a fight of total desperation, where men fought beyond normal human endurance. Soldiers who were wounded continued fighting until they collapsed. Units that lost half their men kept fighting. The bodies piled so high in some areas that they created literal walls that had to be climbed over to reach the enemy. The Cock Beck ravine on the Lancastrian right flank became a death trap. As the Lancastrian army began to falter in the late afternoon, soldiers on that flank tried to retreat across the Beck, a small stream in a steep-sided ravine. But the slope was icy and steep. Men in armor couldn't climb it. They fell into the stream and drowned, weighed down by armor. Others fell on top of them. The Cock Beck became so choked with bodies that survivors literally crossed by walking on corpses. Contemporary sources claim the water ran red with blood for days afterward. One chronicle states that bodies dammed the stream, causing it to overflow its banks, and that the gore was so thick it created a bridge of bodies that allowed Yorkists to pursue fleeing Lancastrians across. By late afternoon, around 4 or 5 p.m., the Lancastrian army finally broke. After 10 hours of continuous combat, exhausted beyond endurance, having lost perhaps half their numbers to death or wounds, the Lancastrians began to flee. The Yorkists pursued without mercy. Edward IV had given explicit orders: no prisoners. The pursuit became a massacre that continued for miles. Fleeing Lancastrians were cut down from behind by Yorkist cavalry and infantry. Some tried to surrender and were killed anyway. Others fled toward the village of Tadcaster 6 miles away, with Yorkists hunting them through the snow. Contemporary sources describe bodies littering the road for miles. The villages between Towton and Tadcaster were scenes of slaughter as Yorkists hunted down Lancastrians, hiding in buildings, and killed them. The pursuit continued until darkness made further killing impossible. When night finally ended the slaughter, the battlefield and surrounding countryside were carpeted with dead. The snow that had fallen all day was stained red across an area of several square miles. The magnitude of the casualties shocked even contemporary witnesses who had seen multiple battles. Conservative estimates suggest 28,000 dead. Some chroniclers claimed 38,000. If the higher estimates are accurate, roughly half of all combatants died at Towton, a casualty rate almost unheard of in medieval warfare. For comparison, Agincourt killed perhaps 8,000 total. Towton killed 3 to 4 times as many in one day. The aftermath of Towton was equally brutal. Edward IV ordered that captured Lancastrian nobles should be executed without trial. The Duke of Somerset and other commanders escaped north toward Scotland, but many lesser nobles were captured and beheaded in the days following the battle. The bodies of the dead were left on the battlefield for days because there were too many to bury quickly. Locals eventually buried them in mass graves, but the sheer number of corpses overwhelmed the capacity of nearby villages. Archaeological excavations at Towton in the 1990s uncovered a mass grave containing approximately 50 bodies, but this represents a tiny fraction of the dead. Analysis of the skeletons revealed horrific wounds, skulls split by sword blows, facial bones crushed by war hammers, evidence of multiple blows to the head suggesting soldiers were struck repeatedly as they fell. The forensic evidence confirms the chronicler's accounts of savage brutality. These men were not killed cleanly. They were hacked and beaten to death in close-quarters combat that was more butchery than warfare. The political consequences were immediate. Edward IV was secure on the throne. Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and their son fled to Scotland and eventually to France, continuing resistance but never threatening Edward's power again until 1470. The Lancastrian cause was broken, their nobility decimated, their army destroyed. The Wars of the Roses would continue sporadically for another 24 years, but Towton was the decisive engagement that settled the conflict for a generation. The human cost of Towton extended far beyond the battlefield. 28,000 to 38,000 men dead in one day meant that almost every family in northern England lost someone. Villages were depopulated. Entire communities had their young men wiped out. The economic impact was severe because those men were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers whose loss created immediate hardship for their families and communities. Women became widows, children became orphans, and there were no pensions or support systems for them. They simply had to survive as best they could. The psychological trauma affected England for decades. Stories of the battle's horror passed into folklore. The battlefield became known as a haunted place. Locals reported hearing screams and seeing ghosts for generations. The immediate burial problem was so severe that bodies were still being found and buried months later. The Cock Beck ravine had to be cleared of corpses to allow water to flow again. The scale of death was so beyond normal experience that it traumatized the nation. England in 1461 had a population of roughly 2 to 3 million. The battle at Towton killed 1% of the entire English population in a single day. Proportionally, this would be like a modern battle killing 700,000 Americans in one afternoon. The impact on national consciousness was profound and lasting. The methodology of killing at Towton was particularly brutal because of the weapons used. The English bill, the common soldier's weapon, was designed to hook opponents and pull them down, then strike them while they were helpless on the ground. Soldiers would hook a man's leg or neck, yank him off his feet, then beat him to death with repeated blows. Poleaxes were designed to penetrate armor through impact force. A skilled soldier could crush a helmet with a poleaxe strike, killing instantly, or break arms and legs, rendering opponents helpless for finishing blows. Warhammers had spiked backs that could punch through plate armor with direct hits. The archaeological evidence from the mass grave shows multiple head wounds on single individuals, indicating soldiers were beaten about the head repeatedly until they died. This was not quick death. Most soldiers died slowly from accumulated wounds, bleeding out or suffocating from facial injuries while lying in the snow among thousands of other dying men. The horror was amplified by the duration. 10 hours of continuous combat meant soldiers fought until they literally couldn't lift their arms anymore, then continued fighting with whatever strength remained, then died of exhaustion or were killed by slightly less exhausted enemies. The snowstorm added another layer of misery, with freezing temperatures, wet conditions, and reduced visibility, making everything worse. The command decisions at Towton are still debated by military historians. The Lancastrian commanders made critical errors. Abandoning their defensive position because of arrow casualties was probably correct given the situation, but they failed to coordinate their assault, allowing it to become a grinding melee rather than a decisive attack. Their failure to guard their left flank allowed Norfolk's arrival to change the battle's momentum. Edward IV, despite his youth, showed brilliant tactical leadership by holding his line during the Lancastrian pressure, then counterattacking at the right moment. His personal example of fighting in the front ranks was crucial for morale. Medieval soldiers would break and run if they believed their cause was lost, but Edward's presence and obvious courage kept Yorkists fighting when many would have fled. The decision to give no quarter was strategically sound but morally horrific. It ensured that enemy nobles couldn't regroup for future resistance, but it also guaranteed maximum casualties and created blood feuds that lasted generations. Edward gained security at the cost of tens of thousands of lives and permanent enmity from Lancastrian supporters. The mythology around Towton developed quickly. Within decades, the battle was being described as divine judgment, with the snowstorm seen as God's intervention favoring Edward IV. Protestant reformers later used Towton as evidence of Catholic England's barbarism, convenient propaganda that ignored the religious complexity of the Wars of the Roses. Victorian historians romanticized the battle as an example of English fighting spirit, which was nationalistic nonsense that glossed over the Civil War's tragedy. Modern historians recognize Towton as what it actually was, a catastrophic Civil War battle where dynastic ambitions led to unprecedented slaughter of Englishmen by Englishmen. The casualty figures remain disputed, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 42,000 dead. But even the conservative estimate makes it Britain's bloodiest battle. The archaeological evidence confirms the brutality, but can never recover all the dead because they were buried in multiple mass graves that remain undiscovered. The Cock Beck ravine, where hundreds or thousands drowned or were killed trying to escape, has yielded few remains because bodies were washed downstream or buried on site. The battlefield itself has been altered by centuries of agriculture, making comprehensive archaeological survey impossible. The long-term consequences of Towton shaped England's political landscape for generations. The Yorkist victory secured Edward IV's throne until 1470, when Henry VI was briefly restored, then definitively after Edward's return in 1471. But the destruction of Lancastrian nobility at Towton created a power vacuum that contributed to instability. When Edward IV died in 1483 and his brother Richard III seized the throne, the resulting conflict led to the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Henry Tudor's victory, and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Historians argue that Towton's devastation of England's noble class actually made the Tudor consolidation of power easier because there were fewer powerful nobles to resist centralized monarchy. The Wars of the Roses ended not with reconciliation, but with exhaustion, both sides having slaughtered each other so thoroughly that the survivors lacked the strength to continue. Towton was the turning point, where the conflict became unsustainable, where the human cost exceeded what the kingdom could bear. The Tudor myth-making that followed, particularly Shakespeare's history plays, transformed the Wars of the Roses into morality tales of ambition and divine justice, but the reality was simpler and uglier. Dynastic competition and noble ambition killed tens of thousands of common Englishmen who had no stake in who wore the crown but died on frozen fields because their lords commanded it. On March 29, 1461, England experienced its darkest day when 50,000 men or more gathered on a snowy plateau in Yorkshire and spent 10 hours killing each other with brutal efficiency, when the Cock Beck River became a bridge of corpses, when the snow turned red for miles, when approximately 1% of the entire English population died in a single afternoon. The Battle of Towton was not glorious. It was not heroic. It was industrial-scale slaughter, where exhausted, freezing men beat each other to death in a blizzard because their commanders ordered it, and because medieval political conflict had devolved into total war where losing meant death. 28,000 men died that day, most of them common soldiers whose names were never recorded, who died for causes they barely understood, who were buried in mass graves and forgotten except as numbers in chronicles. The battlefield itself has healed. The Cock Beck flows clear, the villages rebuilt. But the legacy remains the bloodiest battle in British history, a testament to the horror of civil war and a reminder that medieval warfare, stripped of romantic mythology, was barbaric beyond modern comprehension.